Do you want to monitor Microsoft Teams call quality data with Splunk? Well, stick around and I'll show you how to do that with the Microsoft Teams add-on for Splunk. So Microsoft Teams makes a lot of call quality data available, but getting that data can be somewhat of a challenge because there's a lot of pieces involved. Don't worry, because I'm going to show you everything you need to know to get through it. So at a high level, there are three main pieces involved. There is a change notification subscription, a specialized webhook, and a REST client. Now, the change notification subscription, it listens for changes to Microsoft Teams calls in the Microsoft environment, and it sends a notification to a specialized webhook when these changes happen. For example, when a call ends, the webhook is notified about that event. And I say this is a specialized webhook because it has to respond in a certain way with certain return codes, and it has to implement specific validation logic. It also has to be publicly available and HTTPS secured without any private certificates, and it has to be addressable with a URL. And finally, the REST client will periodically read the IDs received by the webhook and make a call to the Microsoft Graph API to retrieve the full call record. It then sends this data to Splunk Indexer. All right, so let's set up all the add-on pieces to implement all three things. The first thing we need to do is install the add-on. Now there are multiple ways to do this, but we'll walk through the end product experience. So from your Splunk instance, select Manage next to Apps, choose Browse More Apps, type Microsoft Teams add-on for Splunk in the search box, and then click Install next to the Microsoft Teams add-on for Splunk, and we're done. Now we need to set up our specialized webhook to receive the change notifications. From the add-on, we'll click on Inputs, Create New Input, Teams Webhook. We'll give it a name, and the interval is how often the input will check the run status. You'll select an index because the input does write some diagnostic information to this index about the webhook, and select an available port. The rest of this information is used if you want to use an internal certificate with something like a load balancer in front of the add-on, but we don't need it for this demo. But that does bring me to an important point. The webhook has to be reachable externally because the data is coming from Microsoft to your webhook. Now you can open an external access to your add-on, but most people put something like a load balancer or a tunnel reverse proxy or something like that in front of their forwarder so that you don't have to open up an inbound port to your Splunk instance. Okay, now let's test the webhook now by using the curl command. We should see a success true message from the command line. In searching Splunk, we should see a M365:webhook event with the data. All right, now that we have our webhook up and running, we need to set up a change notification subscription to send notifications to the webhook. Now to do this, we have to authenticate to the Microsoft Graph API. So we're going to take a bit of a detour to talk about Microsoft API Graph authentication. So the Graph API authentication is done with something called an app registration. And an app registration is a lot like a user account, but instead of a username and password, the app registration has a client ID and a client secret and a tenant ID. And the add-on will use this information to connect to the Microsoft Graph API. To create an app registration, we go into the Azure portal. And from there, we navigate to Microsoft Entra ID and then App Registrations. Now I'll create a new registration and give it a name. And we can leave everything else as default and click the Register button. From here, we can see our application ID and our tenant ID. But now we need to generate a secret. To do that, I'll click on Certificates and Secrets and New Client Secret. You give the secret a name and an expiration time, and then click Add. This brings up the value of the secret. Now this is similar to a password, and it's the only time we'll see it here in the portal. So I'll copy this now and save it to a document for later. Now while we're here, I'll go ahead and assign the necessary permissions to the app registration. So this app registration will handle our change notification subscription, and I'll also use this app registration to retrieve call records. To assign the permissions, I'll go to API permissions, add a permission, and these are Microsoft Graph permissions, so I'll choose Microsoft Graph. The first permission is a delegated permission named subscriptions.read.all. So I'll select that and click the Add Permissions button. The other permission we need is an application level permission named callrecords.read.all. So I'll add that in the same way. At this point, the permissions have been assigned, but they have not yet been granted. If you're logged into the Azure portal as an admin, you can click the Grant Admin Consent button here to finish things up. All right, now we're going to use the Splunk add-on to create a change notification subscription. To do that, we first have to enter our app registration details in the configuration section of the add-on by navigating to the configuration tab. Click on the add button, type in a name for the account that makes sense to you, and then provide the client ID and secret. This is basically creating a credential object that can be used by the other inputs. Next, navigate to Inputs, select Create New Input and Teams Subscription. Give the input a name. The interval tells the add-on to periodically update the subscription, and select an index, select the account we just created, enter the tenant ID that we got earlier, select the appropriate environment, enter the address of the webhook we created earlier, and the endpoint drop down here lets you choose which version of the Microsoft Graph API to use. The differences between v1.0 and the beta endpoints are documented on Microsoft's website. Just note that the beta endpoint is subject to change without notice. Now once we click the Add button, the add-on sets up the change notification subscription, and we can verify this by searching in the index for M365:subscription. The last piece of the puzzle is to set up a REST client that can retrieve the call record ID from the webhook notification and then use that ID to retrieve the full call record. To do that, navigate to Create New Input, Teams Call Record. This is similar information used in the Teams subscription input. The interval on this one, though, tells the add-on how often to check for new call records. So we'll enter the information here and click the Add button. Okay, that's it. To recap, we have our change notification subscription monitoring for Teams call changes, and when those changes happen, a notification is sent to the webhook. And the Teams call record input runs on the specified interval to retrieve full call record details based on the data sent to the webhook. All right, so we have everything set up. So I'm going to start a Teams call to test this from end to end. I'm going to start the call on this workstation and join it from another browser. Okay, so here is our Teams call record, and there is a lot of data in here. You have information about the organizer, all the participants, and most importantly, the session, which has things like jitter, and packet loss, and frame rates, and round trip time, and all sorts of user experience data. So to make this data more usable, we're going to install the Microsoft 365 app for Splunk, as it has a lot of pre-built dashboards for this data. And this is done just like installing the add-on, and I'm going to use the end product experience again. Now that the app is installed, navigate to Teams, Call Record Monitoring, Teams Call Overview, and this will show you an overview of all the calls that are happening in your environment. And the Teams Call QoS dashboard will give you information about audio and video quality along with individual metrics. And you can even search for specific calls that have happened and drill down into detailed information. And there you have it. We installed and configured the Microsoft Teams add-on for Splunk. We set up the Splunk side and the Microsoft side, and explored call record data. Now you can get started today by visiting splunkbase.com for this add-on and a whole lot more. Happy splunking.